The heavy iron gates swung open with a quiet groan, as if sighing at the prospect of another day. For the 16-year-old boy walking through them, it was a daily crossing into another world. On one side of the gate was the noise and chaos of the city, with its cracked pavements and crowded buses. On the other side was a world of impossible silence and order, where the grass was a perfect uniform green and the driveway was so clean it looked like black glass. This was the world of the Sterlings. And the boy Leo was just a temporary visitor, a shadow that slipped through the gate every afternoon. He always walked a few paces behind his mother. Maria, she was the head housekeeper, the woman who made sure this impossible world stayed perfect. As they walked the long path to the main house, Leo would watch his mother's back. Her posture was always straight, her shoulders set with a quiet dignity. She wore a simple gray uniform, but she wore it like a suit of armor. In her hand, she carried a large bag filled with her cleaning supplies, her weapons against dust and disorder. Leo carried his own bag, a worn backpack filled with textbooks that represented his hope for a different future. The main house was less like a home and more like a museum. It was vast and cold, with high ceilings and windows that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, letting in sharp, clean slices of sunlight. The air inside always smelled the same, a faint, chemical scent of lemon polish mixed with the sweet, almost sickly smell of fresh-cut flowers that were replaced every other day. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floors, which gleamed so brightly Leo could see his own distorted reflection staring back up at him. A boy in faded jeans and a t-shirt, a smudge on the perfect picture. His mother would get to work immediately. She moved with an efficiency that came from years of practice. She knew this house like the back of her hand, which floorboard creaked, which corner collected the most dust. Leo would watch her for a moment as she began to polish the long, winding banister of the grand staircase, her movements rhythmic and almost hypnotic. She was a force of nature in this silent house, the one person who brought a semblance of life and energy to it. Leo's routine was just as set. He would find his spot in the enormous living room, a quiet corner near a tall bookshelf filled with books that had never been read. They were for decoration, their leather spines matching the color of the sofas. He would pull out his math, his history, and his science books, spreading them on the expensive rug. This was his daily ritual, his way of building a bridge between his world and this one. He was determined that one day he wouldn't just be a visitor in a world of knowledge and success. He would belong there. For the first hour, he was usually alone with his thoughts and the quiet sounds of his mother working. The lady of the house, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, rarely came downstairs until later in the afternoon. She was a phantom in her own home, often heard but not seen. Her voice would sometimes drift down from the upper floor, sharp and clear on the phone, talking about business or charity events. She sounded like a woman who was always in command, a queen in her castle. Leo was used to being ignored. To the people who lived here, he was part of the furniture, an extension of his mother. He had learned early on to make himself small, to keep his head down, and to speak only when spoken to. He was a ghost in this world, and most of the time that was fine with him. It gave him the freedom to observe. He saw the way the art on the walls was positioned just so, the way the silver vases were polished until they shone like mirrors, and the way the fresh flowers were arranged with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. Everything was for show. Nothing was for comfort. The huge plush sofas looked like you would sink into them, but no one ever sat on them. The giant television screen was never turned on. The entire house felt like a stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. And then there was the piano. It sat in the center of the living room, the true king of this silent, sterile kingdom. It was a grand piano, black and gleaming, so large and beautiful it took your breath away. Its name was etched in gold letters on the side, Steinway. To Leo, it was the most real thing in the entire house. Everything else was just an imitation of life, but the piano held the potential for real emotion, for real beauty. It was a sleeping giant, waiting for someone to wake it up. Leo had a secret. A secret he kept locked away deep inside him. Back in their small, cramped apartment, In a building that shook every time a train went by, there was an old, second-hand keyboard. It had sticky keys and a sound that was thin and reedy, but it was his. Every night, after his mother had fallen asleep, he would plug in his headphones and lose himself in the world of music. He had never had a lesson. He had learned everything from old videos he found online, watching the fingers of masters fly across the keys, teaching himself, note by note, chord by chord. Music was his escape, his language, the one place where he felt powerful and free. Here, in the Sterling mansion, the piano was a constant temptation. It was like a mythical creature, beautiful and untouchable. He knew he wasn't allowed to touch it. It was one of his mother's first and most strict rules. "That piano is Mrs. Sterling's," she had told him. "It is very expensive. We do not go near it." But his eyes were always drawn to it. As he worked through his calculus problems, his gaze would drift over to the smooth ivory keys. He would imagine his fingers pressing down on them, the rich, full sound filling the empty rooms. He would dream of playing the complex, passionate pieces he practiced on his silent keyboard at home, of letting the music echo through these hollow halls. Sometimes, when he knew his mother was in another part of the house and Mrs. Sterling was out, he would get up. He would walk slowly towards the piano, his heart beating a little faster. He would never sit down. He would never dare to play a note. He would just stand there, looking at his own reflection in the polished black wood. He would let his fingers hover over the keys, so close he could almost feel the coolness of the ivory, imagining the music he could make. He would stand like that for a minute, 2 minutes, lost in a world of sound that existed only in his head, before the fear of being caught would send him scurrying back to his corner. He was a boy of two worlds. In one, he was the maid's son, invisible and ignored. In the other, a world of melody and harmony, he was a king. And in the silent, cold living room of the Sterling mansion, those two worlds were about to collide. He just didn't know it yet. He would close his books, the day's work done, and follow his mother out the door, back through the groaning iron gate, leaving the silent piano behind, dreaming of the day it would finally sing for him. The usual quiet of the Sterling mansion was broken. On this particular Tuesday, the silence was replaced by a low, constant hum of conversation and the delicate, sharp sound of laughter. It was luncheon day. The boy, Leo, felt it the moment he walked in. The air was different, thick with the sweet, heavy scent of expensive perfume and the savory smell of food being prepared in the kitchen. He followed his mother, Maria, trying to make himself even smaller than usual, a difficult task for a boy of 16. In the living room, a group of women sat on the expensive sofas that were usually as still and empty as museum pieces. They were dressed in beautiful clothes, their jewelry catching the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. They held delicate cups of tea and glasses of champagne, their gestures practiced and perfect. They were Mrs. Sterling's friends, and they looked as if they belonged in a magazine. Leo, in his worn jeans and simple t-shirt, felt completely out of place. Like a smudge on a perfect photograph, he went to his usual corner, near the big bookshelf, and pulled out his history textbook. He tried to focus on the words about ancient civilizations, but their voices kept pulling him back into the room. Their talk was a world away from his own. They spoke of vacations on private islands, of art auctions, and of problems that didn't sound like problems at all. One woman complained that her new yacht was a whole foot smaller than she had ordered. Another lamented about the difficulty of finding a good chef who could cook a specific type of rare mushroom. Leo listened, his head down, a strange mix of disbelief and a little bit of anger bubbling inside him. He thought about his mother, on her feet all day, her hands raw from cleaning, and how her biggest worry was making sure they had enough money to pay the rent. Mrs. Sterling Eleanor was the center of attention. She sat on the main sofa, a queen holding court. She was more animated than Leo had ever seen her, her smile wide and her eyes bright. She was in her element, performing for her friends. She told a story about a difficult business deal, framing herself as a clever and powerful woman who always got what she wanted. Her friends laughed and applauded, hanging on her every word. Leo tried to sink deeper into his corner, to become invisible. He knew that in this world he was not supposed to be seen or heard. He was part of the background, like the polished furniture or the perfect flowers. He turned a page in his book, the sound loud in the small gaps in the conversation. One of the women glanced over at him, a look of mild curiosity on her face before turning away. It was a small look, but it made Leo feel hot with shame. Eleanor noticed the glance. A slow, sly smile spread across her face. She saw an opportunity, a chance to entertain her guests and assert her own importance. She was the mistress of this house, and everyone in it, from the most powerful guest to the quietest boy in the corner, was under her control. "And that," she said, her voice suddenly cutting through the other conversations. She gestured with a lazy, dismissive wave of her hand in Leo's direction. "That is Maria's boy. He comes here every day. I suppose it's better than him running wild on the streets?" All eyes turned to him. Leo froze, his blood running cold. He could feel their gazes on him, a dozen pairs of eyes, some curious, some amused, some simply indifferent. He felt like a bug under a microscope. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. From the other side of the room, he saw his mother stop polishing a silver vase. Her body went tense, and he saw her give him a tiny, almost invisible shake of her head. It was a silent plea, *, don't move, don't say anything. Just wait for it to pass. *, but Eleanor wasn't finished. She was enjoying this. The women tittered with polite, cruel laughter, the kind of laughter that wasn't kind at all. One of the guests, a woman with a large diamond necklace, glanced over at the grand piano that sat in the center of the room. "It's such a shame, Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth and sweet. "That beautiful piano just sits there. You never play." The piano. Leo's heart gave a painful thump. He looked at it, its black, polished surface gleaming under the light. It was the one thing in the room that felt real to him, the one thing that wasn't just for show. A malicious glint appeared in Eleanor's eyes. She had found her perfect game. She looked at Leo, a predator toying with its prey. "You're always staring at that piano," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I see you. I bet you think you're some kind of musical genius, don't you? Like one of those stories from the movies." The women laughed again, louder this time. Leo's face burned with humiliation. He had thought he was being so careful, so discreet. He had no idea she had been watching him. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a challenging, sharp tone. "Go on." "I dare you." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards the piano bench. "Play something for us." The dare hung in the air, heavy and toxic. It was a trap, and Leo knew it. It was designed to humiliate him. They expected him to stammer, to refuse, or worse, to sit down and make a fool of himself, plunking out a clumsy, childish tune. They wanted a show, a piece of cheap entertainment at his expense. He looked at his mother again. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was afraid for him, but also for her job, for their livelihood. For a long moment, Leo couldn't move. His feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to run, to grab his bag and his mother and flee from this house and never come back. He thought about his small, cramped apartment, his old keyboard with the sticky keys, and the music that was his secret world. That world was his sanctuary, a place where he was strong and talented and free. He didn't want these women to taint it with their cruelty, but then something shifted inside him. A quiet defiance began to rise, pushing back against the wave of shame. He looked at Eleanor's smug, confident face. He saw the cruelty in her smile, the pleasure she took in having power over him. And he realized that running away would only give her what she wanted. It would confirm her belief that he was nothing, just a maid's son who could be pushed around and mocked without consequence. He would not give her that. Satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, Leo closed his textbook. The sound was quiet, but it seemed to silence the room. He stood up, his back straighter than it had been all day. He didn't look at his mother, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the piano, the sleeping giant in the middle of the room. He walked towards it, each step a quiet act of rebellion. The women's laughter died in their throats, replaced by a stunned, expectant silence. He could feel their eyes on his back, but he didn't care anymore. He was no longer walking towards a trap. He was walking towards his stage. The short walk from his corner to the center of the living room felt like the longest journey of his life. With each step, the soft rug swallowed the sound of his worn sneakers, making his approach eerily silent. The air in the room seemed to thicken, to press in on him. He could feel the weight of a dozen stares, but he didn't look at any of the women. He kept his eyes fixed on the piano, his sanctuary. His battleground. His mother, Maria, stood frozen by the fireplace, a silver cloth clutched in her hand. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to come back, to not give these cruel women the spectacle they craved. But a small, defiant part of her, a part she hadn't listened to in years, held her back. She saw the set of her son's shoulders, the straightness of his back, and she saw a stranger standing there. It wasn't the quiet, obedient boy who followed her into this house every day. This was someone else, someone stronger. Eleanor Sterling watched him, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had expected him to crumble, to mumble an excuse, or to sit down and produce a clumsy, embarrassing tune. This was her game, and she was the master. She leaned back on the sofa, ready to savor his humiliation, a little treat to offer her guests. Her friends leaned in too, their faces a mask of polite, predatory curiosity. They were like a pack of wolves, waiting for the lamb to make a mistake. Leo reached the piano and ran his hand lightly over the smooth, cool wood of the lid. It was closed. For a moment he hesitated. The lid was heavy, a barrier between him and the world of sound he longed to release. Lifting it felt like a final, irreversible act. He took a deep breath, the scent of lemon polish and expensive perfume filling his lungs. Then, with a steady hand, he lifted the lid and propped it open. The inside of the piano was revealed, a landscape of tight strings and felt hammers. A complex machine waiting for his command. He sat down on the bench. It was firm and uncomfortable, not designed for long hours of practice. He placed his fingers on the keys, the cool ivory a familiar comfort under his touch. They were not sticky like the keys on his old keyboard at home. They were smooth and responsive, promising a sound he had only ever dreamed of creating. The room was utterly silent. The women had stopped their whispering. Even the clinking of ice in glasses had ceased. They were waiting. Leo didn't look at them. He closed his eyes for a second, shutting out the room, the women, the judgment. He shut everything out except for the music that lived inside him. He thought of his small apartment, of the sound of the train rumbling past, of his mother's tired sigh at the end of a long day. He thought of the longing he felt whenever he saw a concert hall on television, the deep, aching wish for a life beyond the one he had. He poured all of it, all the silent years and the hidden dreams, into the tips of his fingers, and then he began to play. He started with just 3 notes. Heavy, tolling chords that filled the vast room like the slow, sad ringing of a church bell. The sound was deep and full, far richer and more resonant than anything he had ever produced on his silent keyboard. The notes hung in the air, full of a weight and sorrow that seemed to come from a place much older than a 16-year-old boy. The smirks on the women's faces began to falter. This was not the clumsy tune they had expected. This was something else entirely. After the initial, somber chords, the music began to change. It grew faster, more complex. A melody emerged, a beautiful but haunting line of notes that weaved through the heavy chords like a lone voice singing a sad song. Leo's fingers, which had seemed so clumsy and boyish just moments before, now moved with a grace and certainty that was breathtaking. They flew across the keys, a blur of motion, producing a cascade of sound that was both intricate and powerful. The women were completely still. The guest who had complained about her yacht stared, her mouth slightly agape, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. The woman with the diamond necklace leaned forward, her eyes wide with a disbelief that was slowly turning into awe. They were no longer seeing the maid's son. They were seeing an artist. The social barriers, the carefully constructed walls of class and status, were crumbling under the force of the music. The sound was so real, so full of raw emotion, that it made the designer clothes and the expensive jewelry in the room seem fake and meaningless. The music continued to build, growing in speed and intensity. It was like a storm-gathering force. The notes came faster and faster, a torrent of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. It spoke of struggle, of a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. It was the sound of a dream being born in a cramped, dark room, the sound of hope pushing its way through concrete and steel. In that moment, Leo was not just playing a song. He was telling his own story. He was pouring out all the years of being ignored, all the moments of feeling small and invisible, and transforming them into something magnificent and undeniable. Eleanor Sterling was the most affected of all. The triumphant smirk had long since vanished from her face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed horror. She stared at the boy, at the intense, focused expression on his face as his hands danced across the keys, and she felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. This was not the boy she had mocked. This was a force of nature, and she had foolishly tried to cage it, to poke it for her own amusement. She saw the cruel game she had played for what it was, small, petty, and pathetic. The boy she had tried to crush was filling her hollow, perfect house with a beauty and a passion that she, with all her money and power, could never hope to possess. She had been the one who was humiliated, and the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. The music reached its peak. It was a thunderous, crashing crescendo, a final, desperate cry that shook the very foundations of the silent mansion. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Leo played the final, powerful chords, his hands coming to rest on the keys as the last note echoed into silence. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was a silence filled with shock and awe. No one spoke. No one moved. They just sat there, staring at the boy at the piano, their perfect little world completely shattered by a wave of sound they never could have expected. Leo gently lowered the piano lid, the soft thud the only sound in the room. He stood up, his face still and unreadable. He didn't look for approval. He didn't wait for applause. He simply turned and walked back to his corner, the same quiet boy who had entered the room, but somehow completely different. He gathered his textbooks, his movements calm and deliberate. He had done what he came to do. He had found his voice, and it was a voice that could no longer be ignored. The final, powerful chord faded into the air, but the sound seemed to hang there, vibrating in the silence like a ghost. The room was utterly still. The women, who had been a collection of smirks and raised eyebrows just moments before, were now statues of disbelief. Their expensive perfume and the scent of fresh flowers suddenly seemed cheap and artificial, unable to compete with the raw, honest emotion that had just filled the room. The boy Leo sat at the piano for a long moment, his hands resting on the keys, his head bowed. He was breathing heavily as if he had just run a great distance. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he gently lowered the piano lid. The soft thud of the wood settling into place was the only sound that broke the heavy silence. He did not turn around to face his audience. He did not look for their approval or their shock. He simply stood up from the bench, his posture calm and composed, and walked back to his corner in the room. He knelt down, his movements unhurried, and began to gather his textbooks. Placing them neatly into his worn backpack, the spell was only broken when his mother Maria finally moved. Her legs felt weak, as if she had just run a marathon herself. She walked towards him, her eyes filled with a storm of emotions. There was terror, a deep, chilling fear for what would happen tomorrow, for her job, for their stability. But mixed with that fear was a wave of pride so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had always known her son was special, but she had never seen this side of him. She had never witnessed this quiet, unshakable strength. She didn't say a word. She just stood by him as he zipped up his backpack, a silent, protective presence. Leo shouldered his bag and finally looked at the room. But his eyes didn't focus on any of the women. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was not an apology, but a dismissal. Then he turned and walked towards the door, his mother right behind him. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor, the sound now seeming loud and intrusive in the sacred quiet. The staff who had been peeking in from the hallway quickly scattered, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. As Leo and his mother walked through the grand foyer and out the front door, no one tried to stop them. No one said a word. The click of the heavy front door shutting behind them was like a gunshot in the silence of the mansion. It was the signal for the world to start turning again. A hesitant, single person began to clap. It was one of the guests, a woman who had been moved to tears by the music. Slowly, a few others joined in, the applause growing into a polite, respectful ripple. But it was a hollow sound. It was applause for an empty room, for a memory that had already left the building. The boy was gone, and the magic he had created had gone with him. The women began to talk, their voices at first just whispers, then growing louder and more animated. They were no longer talking about charity galas or new yachts. They were talking about the music. Did you ever... Where could he have possibly learned? It was like he was telling a story. The conversation buzzed around the room, but it circled one empty space, the space next to Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor sat frozen on her sofa, her champagne glass sweating in her hand. She felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, a feeling so foreign and unpleasant it made her feel sick. The faces of her friends, once her admirers, were now turned towards each other, their excitement about the boy a complete exclusion of her. She was the queen who had been dethroned in her own castle, not by an invading army, but by the quiet, devastating talent of a boy she had tried to humiliate. She replayed the scene in her mind, her cruel dare, the smug look on her face, the expectant silence of her friends. And then the music. The music had been a force of nature, and it had torn down the carefully constructed walls of her world, revealing them to be flimsy and fake. The grand piano, which she had always seen as a symbol of her wealth and status, now looked like a monument to her own petty cruelty. She felt small, and she had never felt small in her own life before. The bus ride home was quiet. The city, with its noisy streets and crowded sidewalks, felt like a different planet after the sterile silence of the mansion. Leo sat by the window, watching the world go by, his face unreadable. His mother sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. She wanted to yell at him for taking such a risk, and she wanted to hug him and tell her how proud she was. But the words wouldn't come. Finally, after several long minutes, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling, "what have you done?" He turned from the window and looked at her. His eyes were clear and steady. "I played the piano, Mom," he said, his voice simple and matter-of-fact. She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I know that, but..." "Why? She could fire me. We could lose everything." Leo looked down at his hands. "I know," he said softly. "But for a minute, I wanted them to hear me. I didn't want to just be the maid's son." He looked back up at her, and in his eyes she saw not a defiant boy, but a young man who had found his voice. She reached over and took his hand, her grip tight. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Back in their small apartment, the world felt safe again. The cramped space, which sometimes felt like a cage, now felt warm and real. The old keyboard in the corner of Leo's room seemed more precious than the gleaming Steinway. It was on this humble instrument that the magic had been born. But as the night wore on, Maria's fear began to resurface. "She will be angry tomorrow," she said, pacing the small living room. "She will make me pay for what you did." Leo just sat on his bed, looking at his keyboard, a quiet confidence settling over him. He knew his mother was right to be scared, but he also knew that he would not take it back. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the guests were leaving. As one of them, a woman who served on the board of the city's prestigious music conservatory, put on her coat, she paused. She turned to the butler who was seeing her out. "The boy this afternoon," she said, her voice thoughtful. "The maid's son? Does anyone know his name?" The butler, who had heard the music from the kitchen, simply shook his head. "He's just the boy who comes with his mother," he said. The woman nodded, a thoughtful look on her face. She had a feeling she would be hearing that name again. The dare, meant to be a moment of cruel entertainment, had instead become an unexpected audition, and its echoes were just beginning to spread. The next morning, the sun rose just as it always did, but for Maria, the world felt completely different. She had barely slept. The events of the previous afternoon replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. She saw her son sitting at the piano, the fierce concentration on his face, and she heard the music that had seemed to shake the very foundations of the Sterling mansion. But then she would see Eleanor's cold, hard face, and a wave of ice-cold fear would wash over her. She was certain she would be fired. Not just fired, but humiliated. Turned out onto the street with nothing but a bad reference and a story that would follow her from one wealthy household to another. She got up before the sun, her movements slow and heavy. She looked in on Leo. He was asleep in his small bed, his face peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm of emotion he had unleashed the day before. For a moment she felt a surge of anger. How could he have been so reckless? But then the memory of the music returned, and the anger was replaced by a deep, aching pride. She had always known he was special, but she had never imagined that. She quietly closed his door and went to the kitchen to make coffee, her hands trembling slightly. When Leo woke up, the tension in their small apartment was thick enough to feel. He knew his mother was scared. He was scared too, but underneath the fear, there was something else. A quiet sense of rightness. He hadn't planned to play, not like that. But once he started, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was the first time he had ever truly spoken in that house. And he had spoken with the only language he felt was truly his. "You don't have to go with me today," Maria said, her voice low as she buttered a piece of toast for him. "You can stay here." Leo shook his head. "I'm going with you, Mom. We're in this together." The walk to the Sterling mansion was the longest of their lives. Every step felt heavy with dread. The iron gates, which Leo usually passed through with a sense of quiet curiosity, now looked like the jaws of a trap. Maria's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would beg for her job, but the words felt useless. Inside, the house was silent. It was the same cold, perfect silence, but today it felt different. It felt like the silence after a storm. Maria expected to be called to Eleanor's office immediately. She started her work, her hands shaking as she dusted a fragile porcelain figurine. Leo went to his corner, but he didn't take out his books. He just sat there, watching, waiting. An hour passed. Then another. The call didn't come. Around mid-morning, Eleanor came downstairs. She was dressed in another expensive outfit, her makeup perfect. But there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She walked past Maria without a word, without even a glance. She walked past Leo's corner, her gaze deliberately averted. It was as if they were invisible. But it wasn't the usual invisibility of being ignored. This was a new kind of invisibility born from a deep, uncomfortable shame. She was trying to erase them, to pretend the day before had never happened. Maria watched her go, completely confused. She had prepared for a fight, for an explosion of anger, but she had received nothing but silence. This was worse in a way. It was unpredictable. As the days turned into a week, a new, uneasy routine settled in. Eleanor continued to ignore them. She spoke to Maria only when absolutely necessary, her voice clipped and cold. She never again looked at or spoke to Leo. The power in the house had shifted. Eleanor's power had come from her confidence, from her belief in her own superiority. Leo's music had shattered that confidence. He hadn't just played a piano. He had played her, exposing the hollowness of her world. She was still the millionaire, the one who signed the paychecks, but she was no longer the queen. She was just a woman living in a house that had been filled with a beauty she could not understand or control. Word of the maid's son, who had stunned the Sterling luncheon, began to spread. It was the kind of story that people loved, a modern-day fairy tale. It was told at dinner parties and charity events, each telling adding a little more drama and wonder. The story reached the ears of the guest who had been so moved by the music. The woman who served on the board of the city's prestigious music conservatory. She couldn't get the sound out of her head. She made a few discreet calls, using her connections to find out the boy's name. He's Maria's boy, someone told her. Lives with her in the old apartment building near the train tracks. A month later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was a crisp white envelope with an impressive-looking crest stamped in the corner. Maria eyed it with suspicion. Official-looking mail rarely brought good news. She almost threw it away, but something made her set it on the table for Leo. He came home from school, tired from a day of classes and his afternoon of silent reading in the Sterling mansion. He saw the letter on the table. "What's this?" "I don't know," Maria said. "It came for you." Leo picked it up. The paper was thick and expensive. He tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the words and his breath caught in his throat. He sat down at the kitchen table, reading it again, and then a third time, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What is it, Leo? Is it bad news?" his mother asked, her voice filled with worry. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a dawning, incredible hope. "No, Mom," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's not bad news at all." He read the letter aloud to her. It was from the city's Conservatory of Music. It spoke of how they had heard of his remarkable and profound talent. It invited him for a private audition with the head of the piano department. And at the bottom of the page, in bold, clear letters, it mentioned that based on the recommendation they had received, they were prepared to offer him a full scholarship to their prestigious youth music program. Maria stared at her son, her hand covering her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or worry. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. All the years of sacrifice, of working her hands to the bone, of hoping for a better life for her son, had all led to this moment. The dare, meant to humiliate him, to put him in his place, had become his unexpected stage. It had given him a voice that could no longer be ignored. Leo looked at the letter in his hand, then at his mother's tear-streaked face. He thought of the cold, silent mansion and the beautiful, sleeping piano. He was no longer a ghost in someone else's world. He was standing at the door of his own.